Good deal. Folks, a lot of stuff to get into tonight. Of course, second to last official night of class, day 19, as it were. Gonna try to get through all of the material, or at least as close as we possibly can, at this point with, uh, everything. And then whatever we don't get into tonight, we'll, of course, wrap up tomorrow and then do some review leading into your test. So, here's the deal. We are now in the fair housing section, okay? And I've kind of given you a little bit of insight into this already, but I'm going to say it again, and it's very important that you take it to heart because I've explained to you folks that, and you need to remember this, not all discrimination is illegal. Do not ever answer test questions with emotions or what you think is right or wrong, okay? Just understand that. So, obviously, knowing that makes a little more sense into, what we're getting into and what's going to be the testable aspect of it. So, there are a couple different laws that come into play here in this section. There's, of course, the Civil Rights Act. There's the Fair Housing Act. And I just want you to understand that we as real estate brokers always have to abide by the fair housing laws. And everybody has to abide by the Civil Rights Act. But you've got to differentiate these because not everybody has to abide by all of them all the time. And so I'm going to skip forward here because this slide doesn't really tell you exactly what you need to know yet. The starting point, folks, for all of this section and all the things you need to know are what we would refer to, or the first one was called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Civil Rights Act of 1866. And so the premise behind this one was it passed a law that said that discriminating against anybody based on race or color was prohibited. It was illegal. And understand right here, right now, that this one there is zero exemptions for. Zero exemptions for. So what I mean by that is if you were to ever get a test question that said that somebody had discriminated based on race or color, the answer will always be that is a violation of the Civil Rights Act. Okay? But those are the only two that there's no exemptions for ever because of the Civil Rights Act. Now, as time went on, folks, the Civil Rights Act was actually designed for more than just housing, right? It has nothing to do with housing. It had to do with discrimination in general. That's why it's not called the Fair Housing Act. It's just called the Civil Rights Act of treating people, the same. And so when we get into the Fair Housing Act, okay, by the way, one of the testable things is the years. And I don't know why, but they love to test you on the years. So this starts with Civil Rights Act of 1866. The way to remember the Fair Housing Act when it first came about, 102 years later, okay? 1968 is where it started, 1968. And so the Fair Housing Act does specifically deal with housing. It does specifically deal with housing. And so what the premise was at the time of its inception in 1968 was that if you can afford to live somewhere, you should be allowed to live somewhere. That's it. Now, really and truthfully, it only protected the same two classes that were part of the Civil Rights Act, race and color, and religion and national origin. They basically said that you should not, be picking and choosing or discriminating against people in places they live based on race, color, religion, national origin. And that's where it's set for a while. And then there was what we basically call an amendment to it. It was a separate law, but it kind of got tacked on to it. It's called the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. The Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. And it added in sex. And historically, sex meant male or female. Of course, with more recent interpretations and things that were passed in like the 2021 time, they now would consider, gender identity and sexual orientation, kind of grouped in there. They didn't create a new class, but they did kind of group it in there with an executive order that was signed. And then there was the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988 that added in disability and familial status. Okay, disability and familial status. And so all of these combined now make up the current, as it sits, Fair Housing Act. Okay, the current, as it sits, Fair Housing Act. So here is the list of protected classes, folks. Now, familial status is whether somebody has kids or is pregnant and expecting. Okay, it has nothing to do with being married or anything like that. Familial status is whether or not you have children. People under the age of 18 are pregnant women. Race, physical or genetic traits shared by a group. E and O are placeholders here. Equal opportunity, right? That is kind of the slogan for fair housing. So E and O are placeholders to make this acronym or this mnemonic fresh corn work. Sex, right, is male or female historically, but now includes gender identity and sexual orientation. Handicap or disability or perceived disability. Color, prejudice of skin color. O is the other placeholder. And then, of course, religion and national origin. Now, here's what you have to understand right here, right now. These are all of the protected classes under fair housing. Okay? Two very important things to understand. Civil Rights Act is something different. Fair housing only applies to residential landlords and real estate brokers. That's it. It always applies to residential landlords and real estate brokers. And then the last thing you have to understand, if it's not on this list, it's not protected. So in other words, I kind of gave you this insight whenever we were talking about ECOA. ECOA, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, age is a protected class. Age is not protected here. So if we said somebody discriminated against somebody in selling their house because they were 70 years old, not a violation of fair housing. It's not a name protected class. The other question I get all the time, people are like, oh, is it discrimination if somebody won't accept a VA loan? No, veterans are not a protected class. Source of income discrimination is not a protected class. So if it's not on this list, it's not protected. So a couple things to continue on here. Well, actually, let me just give you an example, folks. If you were to get a test question that said somebody refused to sell their house to somebody because they were Caucasian, right? That would fall into that race category. That would be a violation of Civil Rights Act, bar none. But you'll realize that, certain people are exempt from fair housing. So it wouldn't be a fair housing violation because if you're not bound by fair housing, then you wouldn't be violating this law. So let me give you another example. If we said somebody refused to sell a home to somebody originally from the country of Chile, if they are one of the named exemptions that we're going to get into in a minute, they are not in violation of fair housing. If they're bound by fair housing laws, they'd be in violation. But if they're an exemption, they have not broken any laws. And that's why I'm telling you, not all discrimination is illegal. You've got to make sure you understand exactly the context of the question. What you got, Brooks? Are you muted? There you go.
Yeah, sorry. It's been a hell of a night. A hell of a day. So would it be correct in saying that this just goes for the seller, or does it go for the buyer as well? Like, can the buyer ask about, like, say if their neighbors are Indian or whatever like that? Like, is that also a violation of any of these, or is it or that just um,
Yeah, I mean,
not a material fact.
you're talking about with neighbors?
Yeah, like if it's the neighbors or if it's like a predominantly certain race neighborhood or whatever.
So the interesting thing is, that would just fall under blatant discrimination. It wouldn't necessarily fall under fair housing. Fair housing deals with places you're buying to live and rent. The neighbors kind of don't necessarily fall into that. They could be guilty of other things like assault or, things of that nature, but it wouldn't necessarily fall into this category. And they're not going to get into that, obviously, on the test either. But there are some other specific things we're going to talk about.
In real life, could that be grounds for a not listing agreement, agency agreement to be terminated on behalf of the agent?
Yes, an agent should not be working with somebody who is discriminatory because we can get in trouble. So it would be grounds for termination and separating that relationship. That's exactly right. Yeah. So I'm going to give you some more examples of how you need to, because not everybody, I'm telling you, fair housing laws, the only people who are really bound by them are real estate brokers and residential landlords. And so I'm going to name out some very specific exemptions here in just a second. So let's keep talking about these protected classes a little bit more. Okay. I've told you, number one, the dates are kind of important, and I'm going to bring that chart back up in a second. Of course, as I told you, familial status deals with pregnant women expecting or people under the age of 18. And one thing to be aware of, there is an acceptable practice of HUD, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and even sometimes certain municipalities having a standard on how many heartbeats per bedroom. And you have to understand that's not discrimination because it's not talking about who those heartbeats can be, right? We're not saying they can't be kids. We're just stating they can't be more than 2 heartbeats per bedroom, meaning if you've got a 2-bedroom apartment, occupancy limits could say only 4 people could live there. Kids, adults, doesn't matter. 4 people is 4 people. But if they tried to limit it, on the basis of kids, that would be discriminatory. Now, let me make sure you're with me here because you got to keep these two separate, right? Civil Rights Act versus Fair Housing Act. The Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination based on what 2 classes? There you go. Race and color. Race and color. And so then the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968, when it started, prohibited discrimination in housing based on what protected classes? There you go. Race, color, religion, national origin. Okay, race, color, religion, national origin. And so certain times people are exempt from fair housing, but nobody's ever exempt from the Civil Rights Act. You got to keep that straight because it may say which of the following laws were broken: Civil Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, Civil Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. I'm going to give you some examples in just a second. So, when we had the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, that added in what? There you go. Sex. And then the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, where it ended up and currently is, added in what? There you go. Disability and familial status. Now, as we're talking about these protected classes, folks, let me provide clarity on the disability or handicapping condition. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the material facts section when we started talking about things you couldn't discuss, like whether somebody has had or died from AIDS or HIV. That's because real estate agents are always bound by fair housing, and that would fall under the disability or handicapping condition. Other things, auditory impairments, visual impairments, things of that nature. Of course, anytime we're dealing with mental disabilities, a lot of different things that come into play here. Now, one of the most testable aspects of this is when we're dealing with reasonable accommodations. Okay, one of the guidelines from fair housing is that the landlord and or property manager has to allow or make reasonable accommodations, and they can be done at any time, and the clarification is they do not have to be at the owner's expense. So for example, if somebody is a tenant in a home renting it and they ask to install a wheelchair ramp on the front porch, that is a reasonable accommodation. You have to allow them to install it, but they are responsible for paying for it. So the owner doesn't have to pay for it, and you can also negotiate what's called a restoration agreement that says at the end of their tenancy, they would have to restore it back. Key testable piece though, you cannot raise the rent because of it. You cannot charge them a greater tenant security deposit because of it, right? But you can negotiate the restoration agreement that they have to fix it back. So, also remember I told you those it can be made at any time. They don't have to be made at the start of tenancy or anything like that. So here's where we're going to get into the exemptions, okay? When we're talking about fair housing, there is a Federal Fair Housing Act and there is a State Fair Housing Act. Okay, Federal Fair Housing Act, State Fair Housing Act. The protected classes mirror each other. Nothing too crazy there. The exemptions are slightly different. Okay, the exemptions are slightly different. So when we're dealing with the Federal Fair Housing Act, a for sale by owner is exempt from adhering to the Fair Housing Act. Never the Civil Rights Act. Okay, there's no exceptions to the Civil Rights Act. But a for sale by owner, when they are selling a home that's owned by them, and they do not own more than 3 such homes at one time, and they don't sell more than one per every 2 years. Okay, in other words, if you're like a major investor and you're just doing it back to back to back, you wouldn't be exempt. And so long as a broker is not involved and there's no discrimination in advertising. So let me give you an example of what I mean here. If somebody under federal fair housing laws was a single person owner, right? They own the property and they're selling it as a for sale by owner, and somebody comes along who wants to buy their house and they refuse to sell it to them because they're from China, they have not broken the law because they are exempt from adhering to fair housing, and being from China is country of origin. Everybody see what I'm saying here? Now, if they refuse to rent to somebody based on having brown skin, that'd be discrimination because that would be skin color, right? Race and color are always protected under the Civil Rights Act. There's no exemptions for that. You kind of see how the questions differentiate here. Everything can be basically discriminated against if you're an exemption, except for race and color. Now, there's a couple other exemptions that come into play here. So, under federal fair housing, the for sale by owner is number 1. The next one is what we call the roommate rule. It says rental and owner-occupied 1 to 4 family dwelling unit. So, what this is stating is if you are renting a room or a unit in a house up to a quadruplex, if the owner lives there themselves, they are allowed to pick and choose who rents the other rooms, so long as it's not based on race or color, because race or color would be a violation of the Civil Rights Act. So if somebody refuses to rent to somebody because they're a man, they're not in trouble if they also live there, because it'd be owner occupied and they're not bound by the fair housing laws. You see how this is starting to go? Everything could be discriminated against except for race or color under the right circumstances. They could refuse to rent to somebody because they're Muslim, because of religion, right? If they're exempt, they don't have to. And please understand that this exemption isn't so much like designed to be blatantly racist, discriminatory, or otherwise. It's just that you're kind of screwed because, you know, if it's somewhere that somebody lives, you want them to feel safe. And obviously, how do you do that? Because, I mean, think about it. You know, while we take race or whatever out of it, if there's a woman who owns a quadruplex, she may not, or a duplex, she may not want to rent to a man on the other side because it may not make her feel as safe. And so, you know, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So you just kind of said, okay, well, it's an exemption because you live there. Once again, not designed to be blatantly discriminatory. It's more about people feeling comfortable. But by proxy, people can be discriminatory. Yet again, no discriminatory advertising in any way, shape, or form would be allowed. But, as long as that's not present. What you got, Beverly?
So, with these exemptions for a person that is, say, a person is Chinese,
Mm-hmm.
that exemption for a FSBO person, they can't discriminate based on race, but they can on country of origin.
Mhm.
Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, and so that's where
Chinese, a race,
Asian.
Asian. Sorry, yeah, that would be considered a.
And yeah, and that's the thing. Race is one of those weird things. The best way to think about race is what you put on paperwork. Caucasian, Native American, African American. What is it? Pacific Islander. I mean, like, it's all those kind of like broad categorizations because, being African American is a race or an ethnicity, but there are African American people in the United States. There's in Spain. There's in France. I mean, it's one of those things. There's Caucasian people all over the world too. So it's kind of one of those interesting things. So I would think of like race or ethnicity kind of grouped together as like the paperwork. Would you Hispanic, Asian, Caucasian, African, things like that. Not so much being from Chile, being from China, that would be country of origin.
It makes no sense though.
Yeah.
Well, you tell the government that. That's how they group it.
So, like, a person could be of Asian descent, but their country of origin could be from the U.S., right? Like, they could be born here, obviously, and Asian. And,
Yeah, so, I mean, if you look at, like, the federal list of race, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. I mean, that's kind of like what you're dealing with. And so, once again, you can be white, but be from France. You can be white and be from South Africa. Yeah, I mean, that's race and color of skin and or, your ethnicity. Don't get so caught into it. Just know that country of origin is not protected. Okay, that you can say I'm not renting to them because they're from, Guam, but because you're talking about where they're specifically from, not what their race is.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, roommate rule applies in both North Carolina and the federal level. Private clubs, or I'm sorry, let me talk about this religious organizations. They're named as an exemption because if, like, let's say it's like Christian housing or something like that, they are allowed to be discriminatory to where they're only allowing other Christians so long as they're not limiting who can join their Christianity. Right, that's kind of the thing. They're not limiting that, but they can limit it to a certain religion. Private clubs, same thing. As long as they're not restricting who is a member of the private club, they can restrict it to only other members using it. And then understand, too, that there is no exception when a broker is involved, okay? So this is the federal. When we get into the state, the exemptions are slightly different, ever so slightly. So let me ask you a question here. Under federal laws, an owner-occupied duplex allows the owner to rent the other half of her residence to females only. True. There you go. Because the roommate rule comes into play. Now, this is one of the only times where you can advertise that. You're not allowed to really go outside of the advertising of, like, females only, males only. That's the only one that's not really considered discriminatory so much as it is just a, preference kind of thing. So when you're advertising even for the roommate rule, you wouldn't say, no people from this country, no people of this religion. You want to make sure you don't use any discriminatory advertising, but what we're saying is you can pick and choose who you rent to, so long as it's not based on race or color. Now, when we're talking about the enforcement, folks, there's some random questions that sometimes come up. Of course, the fair housing on a federal level is administered by the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, kind of like part of it, but HUD is really the one who deals with it, Department of Housing and Urban Development. They would be the ones that you file the complaint to. And then, of course, HUD would have up to 100 days to determine if there was some violation, because as you might imagine, people will sometimes make claims that this was the thing all along, but it really wasn't. Some people will sometimes say, oh, they were discriminatory against me because whatever. And really it was because they didn't have good credit, or they, whatever it may have been. And so they will review it. And of course, within 100 days, decide if they're going to move forward with going after somebody or if they're going to dismiss it. So on a federal level, enforced by the HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development. Mm-hmm. Now, they're not going to get into too many specifics on here, folks. Of course, hearings depend on exactly what was come to pass and all the facts of the case and all that stuff. And they'll attempt to always resolve the dispute informally first, when anytime's pushing claims by way of conciliation. But when they actually do go to a case, it is heard by an administrative law judge, and there are fines and injunctions ranging from, as it says, $10,000 to the first offense up to $50,000 for multiple violations within a 7-year period. There are some people who have multiple against them because there is a history of it, and they, of course, go after people a lot more intently than this when that's the case. But nothing too crazy there, aside from kind of knowing that there are penalties and things to consider when this comes into play. As I said, the fair housing doesn't have a whole lot of questions. There's 2, 3, 4 questions maybe kind of dealing with this. And this is also just taking it a step further and clarifying that people can sue each other in court for violations as well, because of course anybody can go through a civil court at any time for any reason. And so if you feel like you were discriminated against, people can take you to civil court within 2 years as the statute of limitations on that. The penalties for the Attorney General believes that, once again, there's a pattern. It could be up to $50,000. Now, there's not going to be... How many questions in general does a state exam have, or how many questions on this does a state exam have?
In general.
The state exam has 60 questions in general. Yeah. Now, the last note here says complaints brought on the Civil Rights Act, which has no exemptions, are taken directly to federal courts. Obviously, there are no exemptions to the Civil Rights Act. They take that a little more seriously, and those would go straight to federal courts. So let me ask you another question here. True or false, age is a protected class under the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988. Yeah, there you go. False. It is part of what, though? ECOA. There you go. ECOA. So here's one interesting thing to bring into the mix here that could possibly come up on the test. Folks, I told you that, fair housing applies to all real estate brokers, and all residential landlords. Okay. And what you may or may not have pieced together yet is 55 and up communities. Because when we're dealing with familial status, right, no discrimination via children is allowed under that familial status protection. So why is it that 55 and up communities can exist? That is because of a special piece of legislation called HOPA. HOPA, the Housings for Older Persons Act. Okay, the Housings for Older Persons Act says basically two things. If two criteria are met, you can be exempt from adhering to familial status protections. If a community has at least 80% of occupants that are 55 or older, or if the community is occupied solely by persons 62 or older, they meet the criteria to be exempt from adhering to the familial status. Folks, you got to think about who writes the laws. Okay, it's a bunch of older, silver-haired people. So, of course, they probably had this epiphany that, hey, we did our time and we don't necessarily like school buses running through our high-end communities. We should make a special exemption that says we can discriminate against familial status as long as we meet certain criteria. And that's HOPA, Housings for Older Persons Act. As long as these criteria are met. Also, just as a clarification, folks, nothing can limit who owns a property. Okay, not zoning laws, not restrictive covenants, and not even HOPA. So it's occupancy restrictions, not ownership restrictions. I can own a home in a 55 and up community. I just can't live there. I would have to rent it out to somebody who's 55 or older. So that's what we mean by occupancy, not ownership. You can't restrict who owns it. You can restrict who lives there. HOPA.
With that, what about master plans that have like sections that are just for 55 and older?
What do you mean?
So, for instance, the Disney plan, they're going to have a section of the homes that are only for 55 plus.
Yeah, that would just be put into a separate phase, and so it would still meet these requirements because it's going to fall under one phase of a community.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So what's going to end up happening is it's going to have its own set of restrictive covenants. Yeah, separated out. So, one other note here, folks, fair housing, because we're dealing with dwellings, of course, ADA deals with public, places you go public, restaurants and stuff. ADA is the reason there has to be like handicapped stalls and ramps and parking lots of businesses. Fair housing is the reason why residential areas now have to have them as well. Basically, they passed a law that said you're grandfathered in if you were built before March 13th of 1991. Obviously, you can't be expected to upfit and meet these criteria. But any residential, with 4 or more residential units, these multifamily, has to meet the handicap accessibilities with like the parking lots and things of that nature, have units on the first floor, all of that fun-filled jazz. So remember, ADA deals with public, fair housing deals with, the requirements for multi-unit complexes and things of that as well. Now, I already brought up ECOA in the previous section, and so here's where, now that you kind of understand that fresh corn aspect, I'll bring that graph back. You've got to know that there is this 3 that are unique to ECOA that are not part of fair housing. So let me pull that graph back up so you can see it now that you're kind of seeing all of them. So here's the big word of caution where people have a tendency to mess up, okay? Age, marital status, and public assistance income. Those are the ones that are unique to ECOA. Age, marital status, and public assistance income. Folks, you've got to keep it straight. Marital status is whether or not you are married. That's part of ECOA. Familial status is whether or not you have kids. That is not part of ECOA. So it's very easy to screw up on the test. If we say that somebody was denied a loan because they had 6 kids, is that a violation of ECOA? No, because kids is not protected under ECOA. If we said that somebody was denied a loan because they were not married, that would be a violation of ECOA. You've got to make sure that you keep these straight because age, marital status, and public assistance income is unique to ECOA. And then disability and familial status are unique to fair housing. But then all the other ones kind of overlap there. So you got to keep this straight on the test. It will try to confuse you. So, Bree says we have to abide by both correct. Well, ECOA doesn't really apply to us. We can't really be in trouble for ECOA because we're not the ones giving loans or things like that. But we do have to abide by the Fair Housing Act. So, basically what this slide is just clarifying is what I've kind of already said. ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, has jurisdiction for commercial properties. Fair housing has jurisdiction for residential properties, and so that's kind of like mutually exclusive of each other. And so ADA is where you can take your service animal on an airplane or to a restaurant, but fair housing is where emotional support animals, could come into play and things of that nature. There's nothing too crazy on this slide to memorize. It's just understanding the differentiation there. So let me ask you another question to make sure you're tracking with me on some of this data that we're sharing with you. True or false, under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, lenders cannot deny a person from qualifying for a loan based on the number of children they have. There you go. This would be false because we're not looking at children on ECOA. That is not protected. Marital status is protected on ECOA, but familial status is not. Now, here's where I'm going to kind of show you the difference between North Carolina and the federal side of things. When you're looking at North Carolina, I told you the protected classes are the exact same. However, the exemptions are slightly different. So, first big differentiation is that in North Carolina, for sale by owners are not exempt. So you got to be very careful on the test because we're asking you fair housing questions on a federal level versus fair housing questions on North Carolina level. You've got to understand the slight difference here. So federal fair housing says that a for sale by owner is exempt so long as they don't use discriminatory advertising, and so long as they don't have those X amount of houses per year. North Carolina states that a for sale by owner is not exempt. However, the roommate rule still exists in North Carolina, and this is another place where it's slightly different. So the federal fair housing said you can pick and choose who you rent a room or unit to and up to a quadruplex as an owner-occupied on the federal level, when it was owner-occupied, if you were living there. On the North Carolina level, they state that you would have to, or they state that you could live there or a family member could live there. Now, of course, that is less strict than the federal law, which means the federal law kind of supersedes that, but you still need to know this potentially for the test. So it says if you live there or a family member lives there, you can pick and choose who lives in the other units. That's kind of the key difference there. The only other big difference in North Carolina is North Carolina states that same-sex dormitories are acceptable as well, meaning you can say that no, a male cannot, live in a all-female dormitory and vice versa. That while the federal law doesn't state that, we'd be remiss to think that the federal law would ever overturn this state law because it just makes good sense. Now, one thing that I can tell you is definitely on the North Carolina portion of the test is who enforces the North Carolina Fair Housing Act. That is the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. The North Carolina Human Relations Commission. Do not confuse that with the Real Estate Commission. Okay, people mess that up all the time. It is the Human Relations Commission. Bill, that's it's criminal enforcement. There are, misdemeanor charges for violating. Sometimes felony, depending. This is another one that's not really going to come up on the test now that we've kind of talked about the fair housing. There is a North Carolina law against sexual harassment. Well, folks, obviously sexual harassment, assault, all these things are illegal. What we mean here is there is a law dealing with real estate. Let me try to summate this for you the easiest way I can. If you created an uncomfortable environment by saying something along the lines of, I know how you can pay your rent this month, that would be what we're talking about here. Everybody get what I'm saying here? Creating a hostile or uncomfortable situation with sexual harassment in a real estate, property management, or otherwise kind of point of view. That's what we're talking about. Sounds like the premise of some bad movies. Now, here's the other thing that is the most testable. I mean, of course, the protected classes, the exemptions are going to be two of the most testable things under the fair housing kind of section. But there is also very big vocab that's testable, and that's these right here. This is what we call the prohibited practices. Okay, the prohibited practices. Blockbusting, also called panic peddling. I'm telling you, you need to know both names. You can be tested as both names. Blockbusting, also called panic peddling. Steering, also called channeling. And then, of course, discriminatory advertising and redlining. Let's talk about these. Blockbusting, also called panic peddling, would be the practice of trying to bust up the block. In other words, saying something like, oh, there's so many blanks moving into the area, you should sell now before your values are impacted. That is blockbusting or panic peddling. Trying to induce fear into people selling based on a protected class moving into the area. Something like that. So blockbusting, also called panic peddling. You should sell now because there's a lot of blank class moving into the area, whatever it may be. Steering, also called channeling, would be trying to take somebody to an area where you think they would better fit in. And so, Mr. and Mrs. Caucasian family, wouldn't you like to live in this predominantly Caucasian community? Mr. and Mrs. Asian family, wouldn't you like to live in this predominantly Asian community? That would be steering. Folks, it's still steering, or also called channeling, even at your client's request. We can't do it as real estate brokers. Even if they ask to be in an area with people like them, we don't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Okay, we can't do it. Tell us what area you'd like to be in. We don't know about anything with these protected classes. Okay, we cannot take you to areas like that. So steering or channeling would be trying to deter you from going somewhere that maybe we didn't think you fit in, or trying to take you somewhere that we did. That's a big no-no. Prohibited. What you got, Raphael?
So even if you have a request, you cannot do it.
No. Because the premise here is if you see a protected class to help somebody, what would stop you from seeing it to hurt somebody? So,
If you let's say if you're purchasing a house
mm-hmm.
and you want to be within a certain area of, I don't know, shops or restaurants related to your to your background, so you cannot, then no, I cannot show you that.
No. I can take you to whatever areas you want to be, but if you say, take me to the Hispanic community, even if I know where that is, I can't take you there. I'd say, well, what zip code, what neighborhood, whatever would you like to go to? So Lisette says, how would you answer if someone asked that? I said, you're welcome to do your own research and figure out what area you'd like to be in. Unfortunately, I can talk about the real estate. Yeah, we don't talk about it.
It's weird though, because you rely on the real estate agent to provide you with certain information that where you feel more comfortable living or acquiring a property, and then you have your hands tied because of some, I don't know, weird.
I mean, here's the thing you got to understand. It may be weird from a certain aspect, but it's also weird from the opposite. I mean, think about it. While you're saying, oh, you want to be somewhere that you're comfortable. Well, is it okay for me to blatantly scream that I'm not comfortable with somebody living next to me anytime they come see a house? Would it be, I mean, you're basically stating that everybody should stick to their own kind. You see what I'm saying? Like, you got to be careful with that. Like, that's not how it works. I understand that you may be more comfortable around somebody who speaks the same language, same, background, and you're welcome to live there. You just got to understand, as real estate brokers, we're not allowed to talk about it, good, bad, or otherwise. Because, once again, if you tell me it's somewhere you want to be, but then I have somebody else tell me they don't want to be near you, you want me to help them equally to not be near you or people like you?
Well, I guess. Is there prerogative?
Well, listen, Raphael for segregation again. All right, we're just gonna all go back to our own different colors and different. You see what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't work that way. You can't do it.
Yeah, because in New York you have Chinatown, you have Little Italy.
Yeah, funny story about that, Raphael. In New York, they actually reached out to real estate agents, and there was we'll call it a sting operation, where they basically called up real estate agents and they said, I'd like to buy in the Chinese community, in the Asian community, in the Hispanic community. And all the agents who took them to those communities lost their licenses because that was steering. Even though everybody knew, the fact that they said, take me to that community when they did it, it was a violation of fair housing. So we can't talk about it, good, bad, or otherwise. Yeah. Yeah.
But we can talk about the school zone, correct?
We got to be careful with school zones because we're only supposed to talk about, we could introduce you to like third-party data for schools. Obviously, schools aren't a protected class, but we just got to be very careful about making statements about, which schools are bad, which schools are not, things of that nature as our own opinion. We could cite third-party sources to you to do your research on like ranking websites and stuff. But yeah, we just got to be very careful with that we're not steering people one way or the other.
But you're allowed to say what school zone the house is located in.
Absolutely, we're required to. Yeah, that's one of the marketing aspects that we would say, what property what home the school is located in, or what school zone the home is located in. Absolutely. Yeah, don't get so caught up on it, folks. You'll learn more about this as time goes on when you get into the actual real estate world, and it is something that confuses a lot of people. But at the end of the day, we just can't talk about it. So steering, also called channeling, taking somebody where we think they'll fit in or avoiding places where we think they won't. Big no-no, prohibited. Of course, advertising would be any kind of discriminatory advertising. Folks, here's the thing that, yet again, you may not like this. The whole purpose of advertisements, or the way that you're in compliance with fair housing, the advertisement should hit everybody equally. That's the biggest key. It should hit everybody equally. And so let me share with something with you that you may not have thought of. If I say beautiful home in walking distance to local park, can everybody walk? No. Yeah, come on, I know. Seemingly innocuous, but not everybody can walk. Right? If I say handyman special, I'm implying this house is better for a man than a woman. You see what I'm saying? Like, you got to be careful with the words you use, because it may hit people differently. And folks, this is the thing, because yes, we could all sit here and say, oh, the world's turned into snowflakes. And in some regards, that might be true. But at the same time, you have to understand, if you're not one of those protected classes, you have to rely on what other people tell you is or is not making them comfortable, or, in that regard. I mean, I don't know. So, I mean, I can walk. So if somebody who's handicapped tells me that saying walking distance is not appropriate, I'm gonna have to just trust them on it, because we never want to make it, folks, it's a word, right? It's a word. And while it shouldn't mean that much, it's also very easy to change it. Close proximity, 0.2 miles, nearby, right? These are all okay. What you got, Beverly?
So when we used to do marketing before, walkability and having walkability scores was like a huge thing.
Uh-huh.
Have they gotten away from that term, or it's just really use it at your own discretion?
Yeah, I would say use it at your own discretion. Here's the thing: there's no perfect science. HUD updates their list of acceptable and unacceptable words all the time, and so one day something's fine, the next day it's not. So I mean, I just take it with a grain of salt and try to avoid them the best I can.
Okay.
Yep. That's right. So the last one is redlining, and redlining, you got to be careful. Don't group it in with any of these others. It kind of has its own definition in the real estate point of view. With redlining, we are really talking about lenders and sometimes insurance companies. Redlining is basically where you would take a look at a map and you would say something like, we don't service in this area because it's the ghetto, or something like that, right? If a lender says we don't fund loans here because it's got a high crime rate, it's not a good area, it's rough, it's whatever. Could be insurance, could be lenders. Let me give you an example of how this would kind of manifest on a test question. If we said something along the lines of, Mark has applied for a home loan and received his pre-approval. He finds a house that he enjoys and he submits an offer and gets under contract. He submits the contract to his lender so he can start the process. Upon seeing the address of the home, the lender informs him that he's no longer qualified and they're not going to be able to fund the loan. What might this be an example of? It's because the lender saw the address and like, oh, nope, something changed. We can't fund the loan anymore. And that would potentially be an example of redlining, because they don't want to lend there because of the risk once they saw the address. As I said, sometimes it could be with insurance as well, but more often with lenders. Just a couple other things that would go hand in hand with kind of the way that you handle things, and of course, discrimination. If you were not exempt in any way, shape, or form, and refusing to, of course, sell or rent or negotiate with somebody on a protected class or perceived protected class. Or the other big one that gets people in trouble is stating that a property is not available when it in fact is. And this is another thing they've done like some research and some recognizance on. They would look at a property and they'd have like a certain race person go and apply and say, do you have any apartments available? And they say yes. And then they send somebody in of a different race or protected class. And they tell the next person no. And that was very obvious that they were picking and choosing who they said they had availability to. And that would, of course, be a fair housing violation as well, because they'd be discriminating based on these protected classes. What you got, Brooks?
So, would the seller going onto social media, if they found out who the buyer was, and checking out their social media account and getting back to the agent, telling them to break the contract or find a reason, would that be part of this? Would that qualify?
Yeah.
As a discrimination, but like even if it's based on like the political views or whatever, all that kind of stuff.
Well, no, I mean those aren't protected. I mean obviously you'd still be in potentially breach of contract, but there is no protected class for political views. And so that's what I'm saying. I mean, people can do what they want to do. It's stupid, but it's not illegal if it's not based on a protected class. Now, I mean, it may look like it is, and so you're opening yourself up to at least the allegation, but it's not illegal if it's not protected. Yeah. So let me ask you a question here. This is the practice of using the changing neighborhood demographics to influence a person to sell their home. There you go. Blockbusting, also called... I'll just... Yeah, there you go. Let's finish it. Panic peddling. Panic peddling. Panic peddling. Blockbusting, aka panic peddling. How about this one? Family asks you to show them homes only populated by a specific ethnic group of people. This would be considered what? There you go. Steering / channeling. Remember, even if they ask us to, it's a no-go. If they say we want to go see homes on this block, we can do that. In this complex, we can do that, but we cannot go to the predominantly whatever community, even if we would potentially know what they're talking about. It's going to get us in trouble. Now, one other piece comes into play. It says criminal charges would potentially apply for anyone who threatens, coerces, intimidates, or interferes with anybody renting, buying, selling. In other words, somebody threatening somebody who's under contract, saying we don't like your kind here. You could obviously face criminal charges for that. Kind of going back to what Brooks was kind of saying with... not necessarily the people themselves, but maybe the neighbors. There could be other criminal charges that apply for that, for harassment and things of that nature, but may or may not directly fall under fair housing. Also understand that for us as real estate brokers, folks, I told you, North Carolina license laws, and commission rules, we always have to abide by those. And part of those is, of course, the fair housing, adherence. But we've already mentioned too throughout this class that we as real estate brokers very often also become realtors. Remember, I told you realtors are different. Realtors means you joined a voluntary trade organization called the National Association of Realtors. And when you do become a realtor, you have voluntarily agreed to abide by a code of ethics. Okay, code of ethics. And so part of that code of ethics also is adhering to fair housing and no discrimination and, all of that kind of thing as well. So it's kind of like a double up thing. They kind of overlap, but under both, we would not be able to violate fair housing in any way, shape, or form. Now, the code of ethics is not going to be extremely testable. It says it's had a code of ethics since 1913. It actually was probably a little bit earlier than that, but nothing except for maybe Article 16, where we talked about, stealing business from other people was going to be really testable in regard to the code of ethics. It's more of a general understanding that realtors are technically different than brokers and that there is a code of ethics in place for realtor members, things of that nature. And this last note says that we have to take a code of ethics class as a refresher at least once in every 3-year cycle. So this is the end of a 3-year cycle in December of this year. So it resets next year. Excuse me. Oof. Let me ask you another question here. Buyer client recently obtained a job with the North Carolina state government based in downtown Raleigh. He asked his buyer's agent to show him only properties located near his new office complex. Is this compliant with both the Civil Rights Act and the fair housing laws? Yeah, there's no problem. He just wants to be near work. Has nothing to do with any of the protected classes. They can tell us they want to be near a restaurant. They can tell us they want to be near their job, their gym, their whatever, their brother. But it's not the same thing as, wanting to be in certain demographics of areas or not or near others. How about this one? Property owner lives on one side of his duplex and refuses to rent the other half of the duplex to a person based on their gender or national origin. Is this a fair housing violation? Yeah, no, not a fair housing violation, folks. This is the kind of questions you're going to get. I mean, it's discriminatory, but it's not a violation because they're exempt. The roommate rule applies. These are the kind of questions you're going to get. As I said, that was short, sweet, simple section. Nothing too crazy there. So make sure you keep those protected classes straight. Make sure you keep them the years, study the years, right? 1968, 1888 for the Civil Rights Act, 1968, 1974,